Elias did not begin badly. That was the difficult part to see. He rose each morning and went to the field. He carried the wooden hoe over his shoulder without complaint. He turned the soil until his arms grew dull with effort, and when the light faded, he walked home and ate and slept and rose again. By most measures, he was a working man, but something in the evenings had started to feel like a question he couldn't quite form. He would sit near the window after supper and watch the fields grow dark, and some part of him would notice, not with alarm, not with despair, that the day had passed without leaving much trace. The rows he'd worked were no straighter than yesterday's rows. The same corners remained unfinished. The same patch of soil near the eastern fence had been turned and left and turned again across several weeks. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't moving. And there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from too much work, but from work that circles rather than builds. His hands knew it. His sleep was restless, in the way of someone whose mind had not quite set down its tasks. He believed, in the way a man believes something without examining it, that effort itself was the answer, that if he simply pushed longer and refused the softer choice, life would eventually respond. He had never tested the belief. He simply carried it, the way he carried the hoe, as though it had always been his. The morning it shifted was unremarkable in almost every way. He woke before the birds, not from purpose, not quite. Something had pulled him upward out of sleep, some restless nudge that offered no clear instruction. He lay still for a moment, listening to the silence. Then he sat up, set his feet on the cold floor, and did not allow himself to lie back down. For the air outside was cool and carried the faint smell of earth and dew. He pulled on his coat and walked not toward the field, but toward the small hill at its edge, a low rise where, if you stood, you could see the whole of his land laid out below in the gray morning quiet. He hadn't planned to stand there. He simply found himself there. The fields were barely visible, just shapes in the pale dark, unfinished rows, the familiar disorder of effort without sequence. He stood and looked at it all without judgment, without the push to immediately begin correcting it. Something happened in that silence that he could not have named, not a decision, more like a small interior rearrangement. He thought, what if the day was shaped before it began, rather than by whatever arrived first? He stayed on the hill perhaps 10 minutes. Then he walked slowly down and began, not frantically, not urgently, with the row nearest the fence, the one that had been unfinished longest. He worked it steadily without rushing toward the next task until it was done. Then he chose the next row deliberately and began. Nothing outside changed that morning, but something in the sequence of his hours had shifted slightly, the way a door settles differently on a hinge after it is adjusted. The mornings that followed were not confident. That is important. He woke early on some days with ease, and on others the warmth of the blanket made the argument it always makes, and he lay there for a moment before choosing to rise anyway. He walked to the hill not because it felt meaningful, but because he had said quietly, only to himself, then that this was how his days would begin. Intention before reaction. He had begun choosing the shape of his hours before the hours arrived to shape him. The rows on the field began to straighten slowly, not through speed. He was not moving faster. But because each morning he knew which row he was beginning, and he finished it before moving to the next, the land began to hold a quiet order that it hadn't held before. One straight line, then another, appearing like evidence no one was paying attention to yet. There were mornings, many of them strung across weeks, where the ritual felt purposeless. He would stand on the hill in the early gray and see fields that looked much as they had looked before, and the thought would arrive, are gentle but persistent. This changes nothing. Other men in the village were sleeping soundly. Their fields were not much worse than his. He didn't argue with the thought. He simply didn't follow it back to bed. This is the part that is hardest to explain because there is no drama in it. There was no moment of fierce resolve, no clenching of the jaw against doubt. He simply continued. He woke, he went to the hill. He chose the first row, he worked it. The days passed the way they always pass, each one ordinary, each one quietly different from the last in ways too small to measure on their own. At some point, he could not have said exactly when, the decision to wake early stopped requiring anything from him. It had simply become part of what he did. The way breathing is not a decision, the way a man who has walked the same path for years no longer thinks about the path, he just walks it. But the mornings that had once asked something of him now asked nothing. He woke and rose, and was already on the hill before the thought to resist had fully formed. His work finished earlier than it once had, not because he rushed, but because the hours had stopped fragmenting. He moved from task to task without the long pauses of a man who has not yet decided what comes next. When he walked into the village for supplies, he did not carry the aura of a man perpetually 10 minutes behind his own life. He was settled. When the blacksmith spoke to him about a repair, Elias listened without glancing at the sun to measure the daylight he was losing. One afternoon near the harvest season, his neighbor Thomas paused at the stone wall. Thomas was a man of great energy, always seen moving between his barn and grain store, his clothes perpetually disheveled. He looked at Elias's field for a long time without speaking. You started late today," Thomas remarked, leaning on the wall. "I didn't see you come out until well after the bells." "The work started before the bells," Elias said quietly, continuing his row. Thomas looked at the straight lines of the young sprouts, then back at his own field, where the rows seemed to wander. "Your soil looks different this year, more even." "The soil is the same," Elias replied. "The hands are different." Nothing more was said, but in the quiet that followed, something settled in Elias that had not settled before, not pride, not vindication, simply a kind of recognition that the work had become visible, that the order he had chosen in the gray, early mornings, when no one was awake and there was no reason to choose it, except that he had decided he would, had accumulated into something the world could now see. When the summer storms came, the ones that usually sent him into a panic of reactive repairs, he found himself prepared. The drainage trenches had been dug weeks prior, during the quiet hours when the world was still. He sat in his cottage, listening to the rain hit the thatch, and felt no fear. The progress was not a sudden event. It was a result. Elias woke early. He did not need the candle anymore. His hands knew where his clothes were. He walked to the hill. The sun was a faint sliver at the horizon, painting the mist in shades of copper. He looked down at his life. It was no longer a series of accidents. It was a structure built one quiet morning at a time. He descended the hill and stepped into the field Kandar, not to conquer it, but to continue the conversation he had started in the dark. The wooden hoe rested near the door, cleaned, set deliberately against the stone wall. Tomorrow it would be lifted again, and the rows would continue, one line at a time, patient, quiet, and adding.